Some sad stories there, and joining me now to assess what is happening to the American dream for those stories you just heard, those people, and for so many others, is Michael T. Snyder, founder of the Economic Collapse blog. Michael, thanks so much for being with us. I want to start with the jobs numbers that came out today, because a lot of the mainstream analysis is touting these numbers as encouraging, as good news, because the economy added more jobs than expected. At the same time, though, we saw the unemployment rate rise a little bit because more people entered the labor market, and plenty of stories and statistics that show the struggle of Americans still. So I want to know your take. Are these jobs numbers encouraging?
Yeah, there's a couple different aspects we should talk about here. First, the job number is slightly encouraging. However, it should be, because we need to remember the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve have essentially gone all in an all-out attempt to stimulate the U.S. economy in the short term. The U.S. government has been doing all these stimulus packages, $1.5 trillion in debt this year alone. The Federal Reserve has dropped interest rates to rock bottom, and they've been doing all this quantitative easing. So the truth is that the unemployment should be much lower than it is right now. It's actually discouraging to see that all of these efforts by the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve have not produced more results. Now, in the long run, all this borrowing is going to be disastrous for us. Now, another element to look at here is look at the number of Americans that are employed. For example, last year, only 45.4% of all Americans had a job. That was the lowest number since 1983. Then if you look at the number of American men, only 66.8% of American men had a job last year. That was the lowest number ever recorded.
And now, Michael, those are some of the statistics you pointed out in a recent column on what's happened to the American dream. And another that you point out is that 41% of all jobs in the U.S. are low income. So this job growth that we're seeing, some of the biggest gains last month were in retail, manufacturing, healthcare, restaurants. We know McDonald's announced they'll be hiring 62,000 workers. Are these more of these low-income jobs, and are those the jobs that the American dream was built on?
That's exactly right. In fact, over the past decade, the number of middle-income jobs has declined by 10% in America. This is a long-term trend and a long-term problem. So you're exactly right. The job growth is in places like McDonald's and welcoming people to Walmart. And that's a huge problem. I remember back when I was a teenager, I walked into a McDonald's, asked for a job application. I was hired that very day because they were desperate to find people to work. But today we heard about that National Hiring Day that McDonald's just held. Over 1 million people across the United States showed up, and only 62,000 were hired, so that's about 6.2%. Now, if you compare that to Harvard, Harvard accepts 7% of the people that apply for Harvard. So today in the United States, it is actually easier to get into Harvard than it is to get a job at McDonald's.
Doesn't seem to stack up quite right. Another question I want to ask, the American dream, another thing you think of is starting your own business, kind of being entrepreneurial, going your own way. Where is that going? I want to know, China, India, we know people are going back over there to have more opportunity. We know there's also drawbacks. There's risks of corruption, not so much stability. But are those better issues to contend with than America's bureaucracy and stagnant economy if, say, you're an entrepreneur trying desperately to make your first $1 million?
Well, today in the United States, it's extremely difficult to open up a new business. Not only do we have strangling regulations, we've now got the highest corporate tax rate in the entire world. It's becoming a very toxic environment for American business, because our leaders, many of our politicians, are essentially control freaks, and they've loaded us down with so many rules and regulations that it's really difficult to get a business going. Meanwhile, tons of businesses are going off to places like India and China, like you said. In fact, since 2001, an average of 50,000 manufacturing jobs per month have left the United States since China joined the World Trade Organization back in 2001. So we're seeing a lot of long-term trends that are really hurting the U.S. economy right now. And if people can't start businesses, if they don't have jobs, they go on the welfare rolls. Since 2007, the number of Americans on food stamps has increased by 18 million, and now an all-time record 44 million Americans are on food stamps.
Really quickly, I don't have time for a long answer, but I'm just curious if quickly you can say how still the richest are benefiting, because you mentioned how difficult it is to start a small business, but yet big businesses, the Fortune 500 companies, have seen an 81% increase in their profits in the past year. How's this happening?
Well, the entire game is stacked in the favor of the big corporations. In fact, the average CEO now makes 343 times more money than the average person in the middle class. And so the government greatly favors the big banks and the big corporations. And so small businesses are really being left out in the cold.
And with that, the wealthiest individuals are certainly not getting left out in the cold. A new study from Deloitte shows that by 2020, 43% of the world's wealth is expected to be held by millionaire households right here in the U.S. of A. I want to thank you for your insight. That was Michael T. Snyder, founder of the Economic Collapse blog.